So good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Angela Booker, Director for Diversity and Inclusion Initiatives here at Mercer University on the Macon campus. I would like to welcome you all to our conversation this afternoon, Conversations on Race and Racism with Dr. Beverly Tatum. Thank you so very much for joining us this evening. I would like to begin with a brief introduction of Dr. Tatum before we begin with our questions. Dr. Beverly Tatum is the president emerita of Spelman College and is a clinical psychologist widely known for both her expertise on race relations and as a thought leader in higher education. Her 13 years as president of Spelman College from 2002 to 2015 were marked by innovation and growth, and her visionary leadership was recognized in 2013 with the Carnegie Academic Leadership Award. The author of several books, included the best-selling, now in its 20th anniversary edition, Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in the Era of School Resegregation, 2007. Tatum is a sought-after speaker on topics of racial identity development, race in education, strategies for creating inclusive campus environments, and higher education leadership. In 2005, Dr. Tatum was awarded the prestigious Brock International Prize in Education for her innovative leadership in the field. As a fellow of the American Psychological Association, she was the 2014 recipient of the APA Award for Outstanding Contributions to Psychology. A civic leader in the Atlanta community, Dr. Tatum is engaged in educational initiatives designed to expand educational opportunities for underserved students and their families. In Atlanta, she serves on the governing boards of Westside Future Fund, Achieve Atlanta, Morehouse College, and the Tool Charitable Foundation and the Georgia Flower Company. She is also on the board of Smith's College, TIAA Charitable, and the Educational Testing Service. She holds a BA degree in psychology from Wesleyan University, a MA and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan, as well as her MA in religious studies from Hartford Seminary. Over the course of her career, she has served as a faculty member at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Westfield State University, Mount Holyoke College, and prior to her 2002 appointment as president of Spelman College, she has served as dean and acting president of Mount Holyoke College. And in 2017, she was the Mimi and Peter E. Haas Distinguished Visitor at Stanford University. She is married to Dr. Travis Tatum, and they're the parents of two adult sons. Thank you so very much for giving a warm in-person and virtual welcome to our guest speaker today, Dr. Beverly Tatum. Our virtual audience is so excited to see you tonight. Thank you so much. Hopefully the sun will come out and the storm will stop and cease to exist so we can get some great information from you tonight. So thank you again so very much. I would like to begin this conversation with asking a little bit about you and your personal experience and what led you to write the book that you have for this afternoon. And so with this first question, so what are some of your life experiences growing up that drove the topics in this book?
Sure. Well, let me begin by thanking you, first of all, for your very warm introduction and also for just inviting me to be with you and your students this evening. I grew up in Massachusetts, but I want to start from the very beginning. I was born in Tallahassee, Florida. And I mention that because I was born in 1954, right at the year of Brown versus Board of Education. And I like to tell that story because I think it speaks to not only just why am I interested in race, but also the social context in which I was growing up. So my parents were both graduates of Howard University. My father became a professor of art, and he was teaching at Florida A&M, which I imagine your audience knows is a historically Black university, and located in Tallahassee, Florida. And at that time, my father had a bachelor's degree from Howard and a master's degree, Master's of Fine Arts from the University of Iowa, but he wanted a doctorate, which is important to advance in higher education, and wanted to get his doctorate in art education. And so he would have liked to go to Florida State University, which also is in Tallahassee. But in the 50s, Florida State was a whites-only institution. And even though I was born after Brown versus Board of Education, after the Supreme Court had ruled separate as unequal and unconstitutional, after they had basically outlawed legalized school segregation, the southern states, including Florida, were very slow to change their system. And so my dad could not go to Florida State, even though it was right there in the same town we were living in. But the state of Florida paid his transportation, basically reimbursed his train fare to travel from Florida to Pennsylvania. He ended up getting his degree at Penn State University. And when I tell that story today, most people think that sounds just so stupid. You know, why not let somebody go to school across town? Why pay their transportation out of the state? But that is how Florida and other states like it, Georgia included, maintained their system of segregation even after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. When my dad finished his degree in 1957, my dad and mom decided together that they did not want to raise their children in Florida under that Jim Crow system. So my father looked for a new job and got a job in Massachusetts at a small college known then as Bridgewater State College, today known as Bridgewater State University. And I grew up in this small college town about 30 miles from Boston, known as Bridgewater, Massachusetts. So when we moved there in 1958, I was 4 years old. My father was the first African American professor ever to teach at Bridgewater State. So he was kind of a trailblazer, and there were very few Black families in the town. And most of my life, I was either one or maybe two, of Black kids in my class. Very rarely more than one, or sometimes just me, sometimes one or two others, but rarely more than one other person. And so that was my growing up experience. I was really eager to get out of Bridgewater, Massachusetts. And when I got ready to go to college, I did not go to an HBCU, even though my parents both had gone to Howard. But I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And I graduated from high school in 1971. We had come through the tumultuous years of the 60s. I was 13 going on 14 when Dr. King was assassinated. I remember that the news event, hearing it on the news, seeing how upset my parents were, very clearly. A lot of the civil rights history that today's students are learning about are things that shaped my teenage years. So when I went off to college, I was very interested actually in learning more about social justice issues. And in particular, I was really interested in the experiences of Black families like mine, meaning Black families that had moved to predominantly white communities, had raised their children in predominantly white communities. That was a topic I was very interested in. But what I found out when I was in college as a psychology major was that there were very few people who had studied that question. You couldn't go to the library and find a book on that subject because it just hadn't been written. So when I went to graduate school to become a clinical psychologist to earn my PhD at the University of Michigan, I should just pause and say that when I graduated from college in the mid 70s, class of 1975, I didn't have the problem my father had. I didn't have, by that time, Florida State University was certainly taking students of color. It's a very diverse community there now. And I didn't have the concerns that my father had, that there would be some schools that wouldn't admit me. I applied to lots of places, and I was very excited when I got into the University of Michigan and spent my graduate years there. But when I got to Michigan, I decided that I was going to write that book. I wanted to write about the experiences of Black families in predominantly white communities. And that's what I did my dissertation on. And that book was, my dissertation, when I finished it, was published as a book. The title of that book is called Assimilation Blues, Black Families in White Communities. And when I started teaching as a college professor, I had the opportunity to teach courses on the psychology of racism. And that became a really important subject matter for me because my students were so clear that this was an important topic to them. The first time I taught a course on the psychology of racism, at the end of the semester, students said things like, "This course has changed my life. This is an experience that I should have had when I was in high school. Why didn't we talk about this when I was in middle school?" This There was so much silence in my students' lives about this topic. They were so hungry to have these conversations in my class that I decided I would just keep teaching about it. And I did that throughout my career. And eventually, it was the things I learned teaching about that class that led me to write Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race, the book that I know many of the students at Mercer have been reading.
Yes, several of the class curriculums definitely incorporate your book all the way to the School of Law and even the School of Theology. So thank you so very much for sharing that experience with us. And I definitely like the point that you mentioned that this book came from your teaching psychology in your course. It's from your dissertation. So for all of our 10th College of Education students that are currently working on their dissertation, keep plugging because your dissertation can turn into something beautiful that can actually help shape and change the world. So thank you so very much for sharing that gift with us. So I want to go a little bit into the book right now as we transition, okay? So in
Sure.
chapter one, thank you, entitled Defining Racism, you state if we live in an environment in which we are bombarded with stereotypical images in media, are frequently exposed to ethnic jokes of friends and family members, and are rarely informed of the accomplishments of oppressed groups, we will develop the negative characterizations of those groups that form the basis of prejudice. And that's from page 86 in chapter one. To that end, why is it important to celebrate cultural heritage months such as Black History Month and highlight the significant contributions of these oppressed groups?
Well, I think one of the points in the quote that you read was that we get a lot of misinformation, right, growing up, a lot of distorted information as the result of the images we see in the media, the stereotypes we hear in people's language, the jokes they tell, the books we read. Misinformation comes from lots of sources. And it doesn't matter whether you yourself are a part of that misrepresented group or a person learning about that misrepresented group. We all, as I like to say, it's like we're breathing smog. We all breathe the smog because we're all surrounded by that smoggy air. You don't breathe it because you want to, you breathe it because it's the only air available. And so when we think about the role that something like Black History Month plays or other, cultural heritage experiences play, they offer an alternative set of new information about the contributions of a particular group. New, and often it is new information. Sometimes it's information maybe you already knew, but more often than not, it may be information that you didn't have. And that information helps us understand that everyone has contributed to our society. Everyone has members of their community for which they want to celebrate. I often tell the story of a woman who attended Spelman. As you mentioned, I was president of Spelman for a long time, and I got to know our alumni community. And there is a woman whose name probably is not well known to this audience, but I'm just going to mention her as an example. Her name is Dovey Roundtree Johnson, and she was a student at Spelman. She graduated in 1938 at the heart of the Depression. Um, had very little money, was able to finish her degree at Spelman in part because a teacher, one of her faculty members, helped pay her tuition. Otherwise, she might have had to drop out. But when she finished, she became one of the first Black women to serve in the military. And when she got out of the military, she went to law school and she became one of the key um, lawyers working with people like Thurgood Marshall to advance the civil rights cases that we hear about, whether that's Brown versus Board of Education or others. A very well known at her time civil rights attorney who made changes that have impacted all of our lives. There are people like that across the spectrum, across fields of discipline that have made a difference, yet we don't know their names, we don't know their stories. And I think it's important to know that, not only so that we understand the contributions they've made, but also because they serve as a beacon for what we might achieve in our lives. We need that information.
Yes, and I do agree with you. Visibility matters and representation matters. I love that. I love that. Thank you for sharing that story with us. I'm going to move now to our third question. Would you talk a little bit about race as a social construct and how it is entrenched in our American society and all of our systems?
Sure. Well, let's start out by talking about the term race, right? We talk about race as though it's something that can, we talk about races like, the black race, the white race, the Asian race, we use that term. But what we know from what scientists tell us today is that there's really only one category that is biologically meaningful, and that is the human race, right? That all these different categories that we talk about are really artificial categories. Even when people look quite different, somebody who's got very dark skin can be as genetically similar to someone with very light skin as someone is who is of a different ethnic group altogether. So there's a lot of diversity within groups and across groups, but the categories that we widely use are not really meaningfully biological. I mean, they're not very biologically meaningful, but they are socially meaningful. And so what does that mean? It means that people perceive you based on how you look, and they treat you based on how you look particular ways. That idea that people will be treated differently based on how they look goes back certainly to the time of slavery in the United States. Enslaved people were designated enslaved based on their physical appearance. If you go back to the early 1600s, when people first came to when the English settlers were coming here, there were people who came as indentured servants. Those indentured servants often were white people, right? Maybe English folks who were coming here working off a debt as an indentured servant. And they were doing sometimes the same work that enslaved Black people were doing. But how could you tell an indentured servant from an enslaved African? By their physical appearance. Physical appearance became an important way to determine who was free and who was enslaved. And that subjugation of people, darker skinned people, including indigenous people who were here and mistreated, of course, we know that history. Um, Physical appearance became an important way to sort people. And we have lived with those categories ever since, with some groups perceived as deserving of subjugation and other groups seen as deserving of being in charge, the white master. Um, White supremacy is all about who's in control of whom. And that is the way race has been built into the framework of our society. We know that over time, the rules of that framework have changed, but the basic framework is still in existence and built into policies and practices that have been part of our society for a long time. It will take a while for us to unpack that completely, but that's what we mean when we say it's a social construct. It has shaped how we engage with each other across these false categories.
That that is so impactful. And like you said, it's going to take a while because it wasn't invented overnight. Correct. I love that. Now looking at question number four. Can a person of color be racist? And I know you talked about this a little bit in one of your other talks that I previously listened to. And then also, what is the difference between active and passive racism?
Sure. Well, all of this has to do with definitions. So let's start with it because how you answer the question will depend on how you define the terms. So
Okay.
let's start with what do we mean by racism? So, well, or actually, I'm going to start with what we mean by prejudice, because some people use the term prejudice and racism interchangeably. So, what's prejudice? Prejudice has to do with individual attitudes, typically a negative attitude um, based on usually stereotypical or limited information. So if I have a negative attitude toward a particular group, it might be because I've heard negative things about that group, I've internalized misinformation about them, I may not even have much direct experience, but I have these ideas. That's what prejudice is, and we all have been exposed to the kinds of ideas that can lead us to develop prejudice. When we talk about racial prejudice, sometimes people um, assume that racism and racial prejudice are the same thing, but they're not actually. Racial prejudice, obviously, those negative attitudes based on racial categorizations, but racism is more than just individual attitudes. Racism is a system of advantage. This is the definition you'll find in my book, a system of advantage based on those racial categories. And that system of advantage is put into place by policies and practices um, that are baked into our system. So when we decide that we are going to have a school for Black kids and a school for white kids, and we're going to fund the white kids' school more generously than we fund the school for Black kids, that's a policy. Now, we will say, of course, well, that was back then in the day of segregation, but there are policies like that that can still be found embedded in our society. So when we talk about racism as a system of advantage, we have to be honest about the fact that it's systematically advantaging the dominant group, which in the history of the United States is white people, systematically disadvantaging those who were subjugated, in this case, people of color, not just Black people. Latinx people have a history of subjugation. Asian Americans, particularly those who came to this country to work on the railroads, who were interned during the World War II, the Japanese Americans. There's a history of subjugation across groups. But certainly when we think about what racism is as a system, I use the language to say racism and racist refers to those who are being systematically advantaged. Now, does that mean that you can't have racial prejudice? Everybody has racial prejudice, but not everybody is systematically advantaged. So that's the distinction I make in the way that I use my language, and I try to make that clear in my book. But I like to say we should spend a whole lot less time talking about who's racist and spend our time focusing on who's anti-racist. We can all be working against racism, and that's what anti-racist means, to be working against racism, to work to dismantle or interrupt those systems of advantage, that unfair set of policies and practices that lead to inequities. And so, what does it mean to be anti racist? I like to use, and to get back to your question about active and passive racism, I like to use this analogy, which you'll find in the first chapter of my book, and it is about a moving walkway. So let's imagine we're all at the airport and we're traveling from terminal A to terminal B, and we get on that moving walkway. That moving walkway is analogous to stepping into a system. We step onto that conveyor belt. We don't have to do anything. You can just stand still, but that conveyor belt is moving and it carries you along. There are some people who are stepping onto that conveyor belt who want to go where it's headed and they want to get there quickly. And so they walk fast on that conveyor belt. We might think, if we think of that conveyor belt as like the system of racism operating, we didn't start it. It was running when we got there. That conveyor belt was moving when we showed up. When we step onto it, we are stepping into a system that is already well developed and moving. But some people will embrace that system. They'll say, you know, I agree with where this system is headed. I agree with where that conveyor belt is taking me, and I want to get there as quickly as possible. We might describe people who are walking fast on the conveyor belt of racism as being actively racist. They are actively engaging in attitudes and policies and practices that keep that system running very smoothly and well. But there are other people who are just standing there, who do not want to be a participant in this system. They don't like where it's headed. They don't like this conveyor belt of racism. They don't really want to be part of it. So they just stand still. But if you're just standing still, being passive, you're still being carried along. You're still participating, even if you're unwilling. Even if you're an unwilling participant, you're still being carried along by that conveyor belt. The only way to interrupt what's happening here is to turn around and walk quickly in the opposite direction. Let's imagine you just turned around. You could say, I'm not looking at that. I don't want to go where that conveyor belt of white supremacy is taking us. I don't want to participate in that. I'm going to turn around. Now you're just traveling backwards, right? If you're standing still, you're traveling backwards. So, what can you do? You have to interrupt that process by taking action, by walking quickly in the opposite direction to get off that conveyor belt or interrupt the process, somehow find a way to flip the switch so that it doesn't keep moving. And that's what anti racism, active anti racism is. It's about taking action to interrupt the cycle of racism. And we can all do that. It doesn't matter who you are. We can all be working to interrupt the cycle of racism.
Beautiful. Someone said, let's take the escalator together to anti-racism.
Absolutely.
I love those, love both of those analogies. And I just want to end with this quote by Angela Davis. She says that in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. I love that. So moving on just a little bit more, I want to talk a little bit more about complexities and identities because you spend a great deal of time examining racial identity in the book. And so in the book, it states the complexity of shaping one's racial identity and how society contributes to how we see ourselves. Has there been a time in your career or even your life that you struggle with your own identity as a woman of color? And did you ever experience imposter syndrome or stereotype threat? And how did you overcome those obstacles if they were present? I think you talked a little bit about that in the very beginning with your personal experience.
Yes, yeah. So, I did talk at the very beginning of our conversation about the fact that my family moved to Massachusetts when I was quite young. And I grew up in a community where there were very few Black people. And I was often the only Black student in my class. Now, there was a plus to that, and I'll tell you what it was. The plus of it was that I was a very strong reader. My mother was a school teacher. She became a school teacher, but I was her first student. And my mom taught me to read before I started school. So when I got to school, I didn't go to kindergarten. I didn't go to nursery school. I was just home with my mom. And then I showed up in the first grade already knowing how to read. So I was always a very strong student because I was, without doubt in my own mind and probably in everybody else's, it was clear to me I was the best reader in my class. And so I always had a lot of confidence about my academic ability. What happened though, because I was such a strong reader, is I actually skipped a grade. So I went from the first grade to the third grade on the basis of my reading ability. And again, that gave me a lot of confidence academically, but it made me the youngest kid in my class. So I was always younger than my classmates. And so I graduated when I was 16 when I graduated from high school. And, all my friends had their driver's licenses and I didn't have mine yet because I wasn't old enough. And so there were things about so I can honestly say I never really felt any imposter syndrome around my academic performance because I was always very confident about that. But sometimes I felt a sense of um, social anxiety. I guess that's the phrase I would use. And that's a kind of imposter syndrome around how I fit in with other people because I was younger than everybody else. And when I got to college, I'd grown up in this predominantly white community and I was very much wanted to have more Black friends. That was one of the things I was looking for when I got to college, and I found that, which was great. But my friends who had grown up in more urban areas or around a larger Black community, knew things that I didn't know, cultural things, slang expressions, or, just popular culture stuff that maybe had not been part of my growing up experience. And I had to work through my own sense of, am I a really authentic member of this community? That was a big part of my college experience.
Yeah, we have something in common. We have something in common. My mother was a second grade school teacher as well, so I do know about being that first student every day when they come home from work. Thank you, thank you. In chapter 4, you talk a little bit about identity development in adolescence, and psychologists found that Black adolescents often begin to explore what it means to be a member of their racial or ethnic group as early as middle school or junior high school, which you just mentioned. What are the potential benefits of gathering together in affinity groups or student organizations or even safe spaces in colleges and universities? And this is for all of our students of color or those that may often feel marginalized regardless of their different forms of their identity or identity expression.
Well, people often ask the question, like, why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? People often ask that question as though it's a problem that they are, right? And that's how I would often hear it. I would show up doing workshops at local schools back in Massachusetts when I was working there as a professional. And I'd come to do a workshop on the psychology of racism, and inevitably someone would say, why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? And it was always with this tone of like, can't we do something about that? Isn't this a problem? And what I would say is to those folks would be, the fact that kids are sitting together with people with whom they have a shared sense of experience. Maybe they're all dealing with some identity issues related to what it means to be a student, a Black student at your school, or a Black student in your community, or dealing with the fact that, when you go downtown, the police hassle you, or you're being followed around in stores, or whatever that experience might be. That sense of common sharing that sense of solidarity and support can be very important. And today, higher ed researchers tell us that those students who are gathering in the cafeteria together are also the same students who are likely to be in leadership roles in other organizations because they are getting refueled. It can be stressful to be one of few students of color at a predominantly white institution. But if you have that support group that you gather with to kind of re-energize yourself, it gives you the energy you need to do that hard work of moving beyond your comfort zone into whether that's running for student government association or being part of the campus newspaper or whatever it might be. That experience leads to more confidence in those situations. Conversely, though, it's not necessarily the same for white students. When white students gather together in a group of white students, all by, like let's say joining a fraternity that is a primarily white fraternity, and spending all your time with your fraternity or your sorority members, living in a fraternity house, for example. Research shows that white students who spend a lot of time with other white students um, don't necessarily benefit in the same way that the so-called minority students do. That if you come from a largely white community and you stick with white kids at your university, you leave that university without really having had the developmental experience of learning how to engage with people different from yourself. And that's unfortunately a lost opportunity. However, if you are a student of color at a predominantly white institution, you're going to spend a lot of your time in class and elsewhere engaging with students different from yourself. So the fact that you spend a portion of your time at lunch or in the evening congregating with kids with whom you have a shared identity, um, it gives you in some ways the energy you need to keep doing that other work that you're doing in your classrooms and elsewhere.
I love that. Giving the energy to refuel yourself, re-energize yourself. I love that. So I want to move to the same questions, just staying in the same vein here. As president of Emerita of Fairland College, you discussed the difference between PWIs and HBCUs in your book. How important are diverse faculty and staff members to recruitment, retention, and graduation rates of students of color on a PWI campus like ours?
Well, we know, again, research shows us that when students of color have the opportunity to have a class with a faculty member of color, and that's important in college. It's also important in elementary school and in middle school and high school. The graduation rates are higher for young Black men, for example, if they've had at least one Black teacher. Just that one experience is likely to increase the likelihood of their graduation rates. So we know that students who are in the minority or who are minoritized at their institution are often encouraged by the presence of someone who looks like them, with whom they can identify. Sometimes those faculty members, having been one of those faculty members in the past myself, I know that students often seek you out for advice. They just want to sometimes have somebody to touch base with who they think will understand their experience, and all of that. That kind of connection is something that white students often take for granted because they're surrounded by other white people. But if you are not part of the majority group, having that opportunity to make a connection that feels like a little piece of home maybe is really helpful and helps you persist. It encourages a sense of belonging. And we know that the more you feel like you belong, the more you're likely to stick it out and graduate.
Yes, we definitely need that sense of belonging in order for us to stick it around and graduate. I love that. I love that.
Mhm.
So the book also discusses a little bit about blatant segregation that continues to persist in our American cities and schools across this nation. Do you have any ideas on how to minimize that negative impact or negative effect on people of color and students of color?
Sure. Well, let's talk about a little bit about the history of segregation. So, if we talk about the African American experience very specifically, one of the things we know is that when the Africans who were brought here as slaves were brought to the nation, brought to the U.S., one of the things that was important to the enslavers, the plantation owners, was that they not learn to read, that they not learn to write, because if you could read, if you could write, it made it easier for you to escape, right? So it was illegal to educate anyone who was being enslaved. We do know that there were people like Frederick Douglass and others, who either learned by being taught by their enslavers or by just osmosis, paying attention carefully. They were able to teach themselves to read, and it did help them escape. But if we fast forward past the end of slavery, when public education began in southern states, it was during the period of Reconstruction, right? When during the time of slavery, there were not public schools in places like Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina, et cetera. There were schools for the children of plantation owners, the wealthy, but there were a lot of white people who didn't have access to public education. When public schools were started during the Reconstruction period, they were segregated, right? Schools for white people, schools for black kids, and they were not equally funded. So we know that the schools that were available for black children had much fewer resources. They didn't, sometimes the only books they had were the books that had been discarded by the white institutions. And, the resources available to invest in those schools was just not made available. So we know that it was not as, wasn't equitable in terms of the education. Fast forward to 1954 and the Brown versus Board of Education decision said, okay, separate is not equal. It is unfair. You have to stop it. However, as I mentioned earlier, it took those southern states some years, in some cases 10, 15 years, to really start to desegregate. But when President Lyndon B. Johnson became president after the assassination of President Kennedy, one of the things he said was, we're going to cut off the federal funding to any school district that doesn't start to desegregate. So in the 1970s, we saw that southern states really did start to make efforts to desegregate schools, and they largely did it through the use of busing programs. Busing was a popular strategy for a number of years, but it fell out of favor in part because there was a lot of resistance to it on the part of white families, but also, and sometimes black families too, didn't want their children riding the bus for a long time when they could go to school in a neighborhood school. But what happened was the funding still remained inequitable. So many of those busing programs were discontinued because of court decisions that made it harder and harder to implement them. And we now, fast forward to today, have a situation where many schools are segregated, not because of the law, but because kids are not being bused. They're not being transported from one school district to another or from one part of town to another. Basically, kids are going to school in the neighborhoods where they live. And because the neighborhoods are segregated, because many white youth still live in mostly white neighborhoods, many black and brown youth still live in black and brown neighborhoods. Because that's true, the schools they attend are segregated. And why does that make a difference? Or what can we do about it? I think it's very difficult to change that logistically because many of the strategies that were tried, like busing, like magnet programs, etc., have had legal challenges that make them now harder to implement. But at the end of the day, the reason the Brown versus Board of Education case was brought forward wasn't so much that the parents of Linda Brown, the child being named in that case, it wasn't so much that they wanted her to be in a predominantly white school. They wanted her to have access to the same resources that those white children had. And at that time, it seemed that the only way to get those resources was to make sure your kid was in the same school. Today, we can talk about the benefits of going to school in a racially mixed environment, and there are benefits. But if that's not the case, we still can talk about making sure that the resources that Black and Brown youth need, whether that's high quality teaching, whether that's classes of a certain size, whether that's science equipment in the lab, whether that's, you know, a building that has the same amenities that you'd find in a predominantly white community, all of that needs to be attended to. And I think fundamentally, that's what parents were seeking. They were seeking equitable resources.
Yes, definitely still seeking those equitable resources here in our nation and country today, especially with resources, especially with education in our communities. I definitely glad that you put a spotlight on that, especially the historical context, especially now also what we're still seeing today prevalent in our communities. I want to move now because we're almost at our time, about 15 more minutes left for my portion with you tonight. We want to talk about chapter 10 a little bit. So in chapter 10, you talk a lot about embracing a cross-racial dialogue. I know that we've done several events here on campus in our communities to have this cross-racial dialogue. But you often refer to the white culture of silence about racism, and you encourage your readers to break the silence about racism whenever they can on page 333. What are the dangers of silence during social justice or social injustice? Excuse me.
Well, if something is unjust and we are silent about it, we are complicit with it, right? You know, if I see something wrong and I don't say anything about it, then I am part of the problem. I am colluding, we might say, with those who are engaging in the wrongful behavior. We need to be willing to speak up about what we know to be wrong so that we can make it better. And all of us have the opportunity to do that. One of the things that I think is really a point that I want to stress, and I do talk about it in chapter 10, as you mentioned, is the fact that each of us has a sphere of influence. And what I mean by that is each of us influences other people. Those people might be our friends, our family members, maybe our classmates, maybe our teammates, maybe the people we work with, maybe the folks we just hang out with on a Saturday night. Whoever those people are, we all have a group of people around us who we are influencing, sometimes without even knowing it. People are noticing what we do, what we say, how we behave, who we spend time with, and that influences them in terms of the choices that they make. And so, if we are aware that we have this opportunity to influence others, then we can think strategically about how am I using my influence to bring about change in the way that I'd like to see our society change. If I see that racism continues to be a problem and it's reinforced by the policies and practices that are in place in my workplace. What can I do about that? Maybe I am not the supervisor, but I can talk about why I think it's important at the meeting. I can raise my hand, I can make a point, I can raise my voice in ways that start to influence what other people say and do. It's one of the reasons I wrote my book, because I wanted, that was my way of using a sphere of influence. I knew how to write, I had some information, let me put it in a book so people can read it. Not everyone's going to write a book, but they can influence people in other ways. And that is, I think, incumbent upon all of us to figure out what is how I influence people. Who am I talking to? Who am I spending time with? How do I use my sphere of influence to interrupt that cycle of racism we talked about earlier?
Thank you so very much. We have some students getting ready for their 6:30 p.m. classes. I want to make sure that they get their books here. And so I want to take this last moment to make sure we do our last question here tonight. So what are your thoughts as you talked a little bit about being allies and co-conspirators and even accomplices at that point? So give us a take-home message about what can we do to make sure that we're creating a more inclusive campus environment?
Well, I like to talk about what I call the ABCs. A is affirming identity, B is building community, C is cultivating leadership. And I'll describe each one briefly, but I'm gonna linger on the A, affirming identity. What does that mean? It basically means that all of us, every human being, wants to be seen, heard, and understood by other people. And when we gather together, when we are in colleges and university communities, when we're part of classrooms, when we are engaging with other people, we want to feel like we belong there. And how do other people make us feel? Do they help us um, feel like we belong? Here's what I want everyone to imagine. Let's imagine we were all in a group photo together. We were all in the same room and somebody took a group photo and each of us got a copy of that picture. The very first thing that we did, we would all do the same thing. Our first response to that photograph would be to look for ourselves in it. I'd be looking for myself, you'd be looking for yourself. We would all be looking for ourselves to try to find where are we in that picture. And let's imagine that someone decided to digitally remove every 10th person. 10% of us were there, but now we're not in the photo because we got removed. Somebody, took the time to just digitally take us out of the photo, photoshopped us out. We would look at that picture and we would say, what's wrong with that picture? I was there. How come I'm not in it? But if it kept happening over and over and over again, every time we were in a group photo, we'd get the photo back and we weren't in the picture. We wouldn't say what's wrong with the picture. We would say, what's wrong with me? Why is it that I'm not visible here? So one thing that we can all do, and perhaps it's the most important thing we can do, is get in the habit of asking, who's missing from this picture? Who's missing from this classroom? Who's missing from this organization? Who's missing from this conversation? Who's missing from this picture? And that's a question that anybody can ask. And if you ask it in a group, everyone will have to pause and think about, gosh, who is missing? And then what can we do about it? If we did just that, we would increase that sense of belonging and we would be modeling for other people what inclusive leadership looks like. That's what the C is about, modeling for other people how to do it.
Yes, inclusive leadership and affirming people's identities and their place in the world. I love that. I love that. Thank you so very much. I'm now going to open up the floor for questions. But before I do that, I do want to acknowledge our sponsors for the event tonight. The College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Mercer University School of Law, Student Affairs, QuadWorks, the Minority Mentor Program, and then the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. If we have any questions from the floor, would you please raise your hand? And then you're going to make your way to the mic in the front, and Dr. Tatum will be able to see you. Any questions in the audience? Okay, yes, thank you.
Because of my demographic, going to a school that was primarily magnet and full of African American students, I wasn't exposed to as many students in the majority, those who are white. So me starting at university, though I'm very inclusive and I've always been taught to, include myself and treat everybody as, equals, I still have kind of a hard time adjusting because the majority of culture is so different from my own. So
Yes.
what tips could you recommend for a student in my particular situation about being inclusive and being okay to accept other ideas than their own?
Sure. Well, I think, as you said, anybody who has had limited experience, in your case, limited experience dealing with members of the dominant group, in this case, it sounds like white people, and not having had a lot of that opportunity, now you're trying to figure out, well, how do I connect with people whose experience has been different from my own? This is one of the reasons, let me just say, why I think dialogue groups are really valuable. Because let's imagine you were part of an intergroup dialogue experience. The purpose of intergroup dialogue is for individuals, students who are from different backgrounds to listen and get to know each other in an environment that has some structure around it. So it's not socially awkward. I'm talking about my experience, you're talking about your experience. We're doing it in a way that's mutually respectful. We have some guidelines and some topics to talk about. And during the course of that structured conversation, we will get to know each other better. And that might spill over into, let's go have lunch together. Let's go, have a cup of coffee together, whatever. And that, of course, pre-COVID, post-COVID, hopefully we'll be able to do that again. But my point here is that sometimes it is hard to connect across lines of difference when you don't have that experience, creating structures or opportunities, or in a classroom when a professor assigns group projects and is intentional about making sure that the group project team is a diverse team, or working together on a sports team. Finding those kinds of connections helps build a sense of shared experience, and that allows people often to get to know each other in ways that they might not otherwise feel comfortable doing.
Thank you so very much. So we have a question from the audience. So Catherine wants to know, has insight on having a teacher, professor, or mentor of color, how can that positively impact white students?
I think it can impact white students. So let me say that before I became the president of Spelman, which is a historically Black college for women, as I'm sure you know, before I became president of Spelman, all of my work experience as a professor of psychology was at a predominantly white institution of one kind or another, right? I worked at several different places, but they were all predominantly white. And so for many of my white students, maybe I was their advisor. Maybe I was the first Black professor they ever had. Maybe they were working on a research project with me. I had a lot of interaction with white students. And for them, it gives them the opportunity to learn some things from someone whose life experience has been different from their own. But also, I think uh, for white students who have not had that experience previously, it's an opportunity to understand what it feels like to be supervised by someone who doesn't look like them in the workplace. That's likely to happen. And if you haven't had that experience, it's good to get that experience and to recognize that there are experiences that they can learn from that they haven't yet had. So I think it's valuable, certainly for students of color, to have access to professors who look like them, but it's certainly a plus for white students to have the experience of learning from someone that they may not have otherwise encountered previously.
Thank you so very much. And then we have another question from the audience, the virtual audience. Can you speak more to crime bills in America that are still disproportionately affecting African Americans in a negative manner? And that question's from Patrick in the virtual audience.
Sure. Well, I will say that I'm not an expert on criminal justice, but what we do know from the patterns of, that there's a lot of discretion in how our criminal justice system works. If you haven't read the book, The New Jim Crow, I highly recommend it. because the author, Michelle Alexander, talks about this in great detail. So for example, if you are, let's just use a simple example. If you are driving over the speed limit and you get pulled over, that police officer can give you a warning or write you a ticket. And some people will say, you know, the police officer told me to slow down, gave me a warning, I went on my way. Some people will say the police officer not only gave me a ticket, but, you know, put his hand on his gun and, you know, acted as though he might be thinking about shooting me. I mean, it was a very different experience, determined perhaps by one's racial group membership or gender. And so that's a small example, but we know, for example, sentencing, same crimes, different sentences. There's research that shows that the darker skin you have, the longer your sentence is likely to be for the same crime. There is bias built in, and it's not a law that says darker skinned people should get longer sentences, but the bias of the person deciding, the judge or the prosecutor who's deciding to bring this charge or that charge. You know, how that gets determined. You know, when is it stand your ground and when is it when is it self-defense and when is it a crime of aggression against another person? You know, how we interpret the laws that exist have room for bias, and that's where we see the differential impact um, in our criminal justice system.
Okay. Here comes a long one. I'm getting this one in just now. Donna Rookery says, as a professor at an institution that serves primarily students of color, but has mostly white faculty and administration, what do you suggest one does to make meaningful change? Sometimes it feels like I'm the only one speaking up or valuing our students.
Well, this is where leadership matters. I will just say that, you know, if you are the leader of the institution, I'm going to speak from my perspective, having served as president. You know, certainly if you're the leader of the institution, you can talk about why it's important to diversify your faculty, your staff, as well as your student body. So if the president says to the provost, and the provost may be the person who's doing the faculty hiring, working with department chairs to hire faculty. But if you have collectively said, this is strategically important for our institution, we need to diversify our faculty, you can provide incentives for people to take the extra effort to ensure the pool is diverse before you make decisions about who to hire. If you only have white people in your pool, you can't hire anybody but white people. You have to have a more diverse pool if you want a more diverse result. How do we go about doing that? There are ways to recruit faculty and staff that go beyond just putting an ad in the local Chronicle of Higher Education or the local paper, in terms of how we actively recruit and invite and encourage people to seek out employment in our organization, and what we are doing to recruit, not just recruit, but also to retain and to promote a diverse range of faculty members and staff. So these are systemic, these are institutional priorities, decisions that have to be made and can be influenced certainly by the person who's at the head of the organization. But you don't have to be the president or the provost to express a point of view. Search committees are often made up of faculty and staff who are in a decision-making role as a member of the search committee, who have the opportunity to spread the news about the openings on your campus in your spheres or your networks of colleagues and peers across the nation. There are lots of ways that you can exert influence, even if you don't have the top position in an organization. It can feel tiresome if you are singing the song and nobody else is joining in with you, but that is certainly an important part of providing your sphere of influence, using your sphere of influence on a campus.
Beautiful, beautiful. Do we have any more questions from our face-to-face audience before we move back to our chat? Yes, please.
Hello, Dr. Tatum. So one of my questions was, as a white individual raised by white parents, um, my parents hold very different views from what I have learned based on my experiences in diverse classes and communities. However, there's a lot of my peers that may hold views similar to their parents and my parents. So how can I and other white individuals, coming from parents who may not hold the same views of inclusivity and diversity, how can we talk to our parents or our friends who may not hold those same views?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking it, because it's a common question. Many people want to know, how can I share what I'm learning with my family members, with my friends, when they haven't had the same learnings? They haven't had the same experiences as me. And maybe they don't see things the way I see them now. And there's often a worry that having a different point of view may strain the relationship in some way. I like to tell people about a strategy which I'm going to share with you. I call it the 3 F's. What do I mean by that? Felt, found, feel. And it's a communication strategy. It's really just that, a communication strategy that you might try, and I have seen be effective with, particularly when you're talking to someone who you share a similar background. So if you're talking, to your parents, you grew up in their household, you know where they're coming from, you might have shared some of the same ideas they have at some point in your life, even if you don't hold the same views now. You could say something like this: I felt that way. There was a time when I felt that way. There was a time when I thought that was true. But then I found out this new information. I found out this new information because I went to that talk, or I read that book, or I found out this new information because I've been working on a team with a diverse group of individuals. And I now feel that this is how I think about that. I found out this new information and I now feel differently. And if you share it in that way, I felt that way, but then I found this out and I now feel, um, what it allows you to do is share your own journey, your own learning journey with your loved ones, with your family members, with your friends. They may still disagree with you, but at least they have a deeper understanding of where you're coming from and why. And it allows them to listen to that learning journey, that allows them to listen to those new experiences you've had, those new facts you've gotten from your courses or wherever, and share them without, in a more direct way, saying, you're just wrong. I think you're wrong, right? You might feel that way, but when you're talking about yourself, I felt that way, I found this out, I now feel, it reduces that other person's defensiveness in a way that hopefully allows them to hear what you're saying and maybe even start to move in your direction in terms of what they are thinking and feeling.
I hope that helps. So we have one question as we get ready to wrap up in just a few more minutes. It says, as a Mercer career consultant, I'm charged with preparing students and alumni for the world of work. Frequently, I engage with students who are concerned about presenting their authentic self during job interviews and in the workplace. Understanding that professionalism standards are decided by largely white, cisgender, heteronormative group, how would you advise students who are balancing presenting themselves authentically with industry standards of professionalism that might not honor diversity in individual identity? Stephanie.
Well, I think this is a hard question because, we know that there are organizations that may be very conservative. I'm going to use that word in the loose term, that um, may have a very narrow definition of what is professional. And then there are other organizations that have a much wider definition and who encourage people to bring their whole selves to the workplace and not to um, pretend to be anything other than who they really are. Good managers know that people are more productive when they can be themselves. right? Um, so there are certainly, as a career professional, one thing you might think about is encouraging students to seek out those organizations that are, in fact, welcoming and inclusive. Now, I have had the experience of working places that I did not find welcoming and inclusive, and I didn't stay at those places, right? And when a company invests in hiring somebody, they usually want them to stay. So if they don't um, make their organization feel welcoming and inclusive, talented people will exit, which is what I did in at least one or two cases. So, so that's the first thing. But I also think we have to challenge sometimes the assumptions we have. I'm gonna, you can see me on the screen. You can see that I have a natural, my hair is short, I don't straighten my hair. I used to straighten my hair. I stopped straightening my hair in 1971, a long time ago, before a lot of you were even born. But I remember being at Spelman, having a conversation with a student who said, my parents tell me that if I don't straighten my hair, I won't be able to get a job. That for some people, straightening your hair means making it look, quote, more professional. And so she was looking dead at me, and I said, well, you see, I don't have straight hair, and I have been fully employed all of my adult life. I stopped straightening my hair in college. It didn't prevent me from getting a job or doing the things I wanted to do. So sometimes we have to challenge the assumptions that people make. Now, we know that, people can behave in discriminatory ways. There's no doubt about that. And I remember having a conversation with a Spelman student, I'm going to use this as an example, who had a summer internship. She was going to be working on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and she was very excited about it. And she was a free spirit. She was a student who, on any given day, you never knew exactly what she was going to look like. She changed her appearance frequently, regularly. She was one of these kind of students who sometimes like to put, blue dye in her hair, and some days it would be pink, and some days it would be, a different color. And so, that she was just that kind of free spirit. And I remember having a conversation with her, and she said, I'm wondering what I'm gonna, how should I present myself? She asked me for advice. And I said, you clearly want to be able to be yourself and express yourself because that's going to be when you can be most productive. But you also have some choices to make about whether you want people to be listening to what you have to say or looking at your blue hair. They might be distracted by that. It doesn't mean you can't have it blue if you want, but it might mean that people spend more time looking at your hair and less time listening to your ideas. Which would you prefer? And so she gave that some thought. And I think that that's the kind of question we have to ask. Do you want to be someplace where people won't be distracted by your blue hair? Or if you're going to be in a conservative environment where people are wearing dark suits and blue or red ties, and they're probably going to be perhaps distracted by the presentation that you want to offer, maybe you want to make a change, but it's up to you. It's your choice. But always you have to be thinking about what is this going to stimulate in somebody else. All of us need to do that.
I love that. I love that. So I think the time is right now 6:44, and I'm going to ask Dr. Tatum, does she have time for one more question, or would she like to conclude at this moment? Want to be a good steward of your time?
Well, I guess it depends on if it's an easy question or a hard one. I have time for a short question.
I think it's an interesting question. So I'll give it to you, and I'll let you decide. How about that? So
All
the
right.
question is, how has the political polarization in America affected race?
Well, I think the political polarization in America is related to race. I think it's not always packaged in that way, but I think what we can see over time, and I write a lot about this in my book, so maybe what I'm going to say is read the prologue of the new edition, the 2017 edition of my book, because I talk a lot about the ways in which after every period of social progress, there's pushback against that progress. We live at a time when a lot is changing fast. You know, technology's changing, our economy's changing. You know, we're dealing with this pandemic we never had to deal with before. Anytime you have a lot of change, people get anxious. And when people are anxious, they like to cling to what they know. And as a consequence of clinging to what they know, part of what we know, meaning we, our collective society, part of the old ways include racism. Racism is part of the old way. And so when you hear people say, I liked it the way it was before, they may not be saying, I liked it when it was racist, but that was part of how it was and continues to be. So when we talk about social change, we have to talk about forging new ways of being with each other that may make some people anxious. Change makes people anxious. But we also have to recognize that we can't make progress without change. If we push forward toward a more equitable society, it should be a society where we all can thrive, and that should make all of us um, feel better. Even if we don't know it now, we would all feel better with a more equitable society.
More equitable society. And we are going to leave on that note because I see that we have like over 24 more questions, 25 more questions in the chat. And I know that we had your time scheduled for 6:45 on the dot. I do thank you for going 2 minutes over and sharing with us so much, so much, so much of your wisdom. So again, if you haven't had a chance to get the book, it is available on platforms everywhere. And the title of the book again is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race. And this is the 20th edition. And so again, we're going to get ready to conclude for tonight. And thank you again, Dr. Tatum, for your time. We have thoroughly enjoyed it. I know I've learned so much. I was taking notes as you were speaking, and we recorded this. So again, this will be available to participants once we get this available from our Zoom channel. So you can find that on the Mercer University Diversity and Inclusion Zoom channel. And again, thank you so very much. Thank you for all our virtual members. And again, round of applause from our face-to-face audience.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And have a good evening. It's been my pleasure.
They get a special token of your book tonight. So the first 100 participants will get an autographed copy that you were so gracious to sign for us. So again, we just want to say thank you so very much. And again, don't forget to look up all of her speaking engagements. Many of them are on YouTube and available on her website. And again, thank you again to all of our sponsors, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Mercer University School of Law, Student Affairs, QuadWorks, the Minority Mentor Program, and then again, my office, the Mercer University Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Thank you so again from Macon, Georgia, and the Mercer campus here. And thank you again for all of our audio visual people and tech people that have helped us out tonight. Especially shout out to Mr. Larry Smith. You may have saw him going back and forth with the mic tonight. So again, thank you so very much, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. My pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.